So the United States is at a crossroads in energy policy, as that last talk made clear. With no price on the emission of carbon dioxide currently, low-priced fossil fuels threaten to displace nuclear power plants and curtail new investments in nuclear energy. On top of that, the disaster at Fukushima has renewed questions about whether regulation can keep nuclear plants safe and secure. So to discuss these issues, we're thrilled to bring together several distinguished guests on this panel. Moderating the discussion will be Don Elliott, adjunct professor of law here at Yale Law School, and a leading scholar and practitioner of environmental law. He's also senior of counsel at Covington & Burling, and between 1989 and 1991, he served as assistant administrator and general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Don, and all the panelists, and thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. We have a very distinguished panel. To my right is Allison McFarland, who is professor of science and technology policy at George Washington University, and also a former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 2012 to December 2014. So no one in a better position to talk about nuclear and nuclear policy than Allison. To my immediate left is former Senator Judd Gregg, who served both as governor of New Hampshire and as United States Senator, and currently serves as co-chair of the Leadership Council on nuclear matters and is really an expert in nuclear policy. And then to his left, David Christian, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of Dominion Generation, and also a member of the Board of Directors of the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is a client of mine, among other things.
We have a conflict there.
As the I teach energy policy, but also, as was indicated, I'm primarily an environmental lawyer. And although I can't represent EPA, somebody said we don't have anybody from EPA here, I think a number of the panelists are going to talk about the EPA clean energy proposal or clean energy proposed regulation. So I thought I'd just briefly summarize that for those of you who may not be familiar with it. So someone asked a question about a national ambient air quality standard for CO2. I advocated that in 2008, and I tried to persuade EPA to do that. They decided not to do that for a number of reasons. They decided to take a sectoral approach and to focus on transportation with the negotiation of a new standards for mileage, fuel economy standards, fleet economy standards, and then also to focus on the electric generation sector, because those were the two largest sectors, transportation and energy. And the mainstay of the approach on, not going to work, huh? Okay, I should leave it alone. The mainstay of their approach is a proposed rule that came out in June of 2014 called the Clean Power Plan, also sometimes referred to by the section of the Clean Air Act that is used as authority, which is Section 111D. And basically that's a section of the Clean Air Act that permits EPA to promulgate procedures and targets for states to regulate existing sources of pollution. And there's a controversy about, which I won't go into, about whether or not it's available even to regulate electric utilities, because they're already regulated under another section of the statute, Section 112. But assuming that they can regulate electric utilities under Section 111D, EPA has proposed a very innovative approach, which really amounts to a national energy policy or a renewable energy policy. And they basically come up with state targets for CO2 reductions from electric utilities by coming up with what the statute calls the best system of emission reduction. And traditionally, that's been just changes that you can make at the polluting facility. Here, for the first time, EPA is proposing to do what's called go beyond the fence line and basically say the best way to control CO2 from existing electric power plants is to generate a lot of low carbon energy, either from natural gas or from nuclear or for renewables. So they come up with the state targets by 4 building blocks. The first is increasing efficiency at fossil generation plants. The second is greater use of low carbon generation. And there are 2 variations of that. As originally proposed, They talked about greater utilization of natural gas plants. They then came out with an alternative saying, well, maybe we ought to give credit for new generation from natural gas plants. And that's been very controversial because, as was alluded to by Jared, and I'm sure others will talk about, if you allow credit for new natural gas in terms of the prices, you may cause the nuclear plants to close. And we currently get about 20% of our electricity in the United States, more or less, from nuclear. It's far and away the largest source of non-emitting generation. So, for example, in Connecticut here, we get about 10 times as much energy from nuclear as we do from all renewable sources combined. So just to give you a sense of scale. And then the third building block is new renewable and new nuclear that's under construction. And the fourth building block is energy efficiency. In a proposal that seemed to please no one, EPA proposed to give states credit for the 6% of nuclear that is supposedly at risk and urge states to implement measures to keep that 6% of nuclear online. But it didn't allocate it to the states where those nuclear plants that are at risk are, but it allocated it evenly with a 6% credit kind of across the board. So those are some of the issues that I'm sure will come up in terms of whether or not this proposal really does the right thing, creates the right incentives with regard to nuclear. With that, let me just turn to the panelists to each make an opening statement, and we just decided arbitrarily to do it in alphabetical order. So that means first David Christian, and then Allison McFarland, and Senator Greg Banning Cleanup.
Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon, I suppose. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be with you today and to offer insights that I may regarding the challenges being faced by commercial nuclear power in the U.S. The subject is particularly timely as the entire electric sector in the United States enters a state of a period of transition to a lower carbon future. I want you to know that I've got a personal interest in this intersection of energy and the environment that goes back quite some time. As a young student in the mid-1970s, I was influenced by a course and a book, and I understand that some people don't know what books are on campus anymore, but it's a coursework and a book titled Technology and Society, written by R.C. Dorff. So if there's any electrical engineers in the room, you might recognize his name as a pioneer of automatic control theory. But anyway, the book was an elective in engineering ethics, and the general coursework was to examine in a thoughtful and deliberate way the impact of various technologies on the planet. And here as a young engineer, after examining the various ways in which we were generating electricity at that time, I pretty much decided that we were going to need nuclear energy, and I directed all of my studies in that direction. So with all of the consciousness available to a 20-year-old back in the mid-1970s, I made that decision. I had been introduced at that time to a theory which was then called the greenhouse effect, that later took on the name of global warming and now enjoys the moniker of climate change and soon is to be renamed perhaps to climate resilience. So I do believe it's an important contribution to generating large-scale baseload electricity with very few emissions, and I have thought that for quite some time. Now, there have been times in my career when I've paused to reflect and say, was that a good decision? One was the accident at 3 Mile Island, and that's been dealt with pretty well here. The other was Chernobyl, and the last was Fukushima. But I still remain convinced that it can and must play a significant role in the energy mix of the United States and of the planet. I was asked in the mid-1990s by one of my employees, hey, when are we going to build the next nuclear power plant? And just to take you back to the mid-1990s. And I said, you know, probably sometime in the next decade, 2000 to 2010, the statistical evidence for climate change and global warming is going to become undeniable, because in the mid-1990s, there's still quite a bit of debate about, is it real, is it not real? even in the national labs. Now you've got a pretty general consensus that it is something that we ought to be worried about. And even the people who remain unconvinced will tell you that we ought to take some no regrets actions in that direction. But in that time frame, we had improved the efficiency of nuclear power plants from a utilization factor of about 70% up to 90+%. And so we had created, through efficiency improvements, the equivalent of 23 new nuclear power plants in the United States, and in essence, we're the victims of our own success. Today, virtually every nuclear power plant in the United States is operating at 90% utilization factor. Those kinds of efficiency improvements are no longer available to us. If it's going to be used as a tool for climate mitigation, you're going to have to build more of them. So fast forward to today, I do have responsibility for about 24,000 megawatts of electric power generation of all types, and I mean all types. I have nuclear, coal, oil, gas, hydro, wind, pump storage, fuel cell, solar, you name it. If it generates electricity, we do it. I'm proud to say that Dominion is the owner of 3 facilities in Connecticut, a 5-megawatt solar field up in Summers, a 15-megawatt fuel cell in Bridgeport, and a 2,050-megawatt nuclear plant in eastern Connecticut that emits essentially zero CO2. Since assuming my current role in 2009, I have closed down, sold, or converted to natural gas 21 coal plants. But I've also had to shut down a nuclear plant in Wisconsin, 680-megawatt nuclear plant. I'd like to talk about that in just a few minutes. I will tell you that yesterday I was with the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, at lunch, and I can assure you that she is and speaks with conviction that we are headed for a lower carbon future, and that is, in fact, the intent of the Clean Power Plan. For all its benefits and desirability as a low-carbon emitter, nuclear power does face some issues. And this is where I want to get back to 2 things. One is the market conditions out there that are not recognizing in a positive way or sufficiently the attributes of nuclear as a continuous baseload non-emitting source. And the other is the financing challenges of new nuclear power plants in the United States. So with that, let me go back briefly to Kewaunee, and I'll turn it over to the other panelists. The marginal cost of power in the upper Midwest is set by either natural gas or Powder River Basin coal, which is surface mined out of eastern Wyoming at $10 a ton. The market price of electricity is about $30 per megawatt. Our Kewaunee nuclear plant cost about $50 to make a megawatt, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, if you will. So we became unprofitable when gas prices started to come off and coal prices came down to about $10 a ton. And quite simply, business is not in the business of losing money for shareholders. We don't have to, we're not allowed to fall in love with a particular asset. We don't have a legal obligation or duty to do things that protect the environment. We make choices in the best interest within the framework of market policy and regulations to stay in business and to provide a return to shareholders that invest in us. So we had to close the Kewaunee nuclear plant down. But what happened, I just want you to tell you what happened when that occurred. Wisconsin went from a balanced state to a net importer of electricity, and their carbon emissions went up by over 5 million tons a year. So there are consequences. Right now there's about 8 or 10 other nuclear power plants in the United States that are in similar jeopardy of premature closure, that are similarly likely to result in increased carbon emissions. Anyway, it's good to be here with you. I look forward to your questions, and again, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Well, my name is Judd Gregg, and as was mentioned, I served in the United States Senate for 18 years, and before that I was governor of New Hampshire. I was there when the last major nuclear power plant was brought online, Seabrook. Myself and Evan Bai put together a group which involves a pretty good cross-section of American public policy people, and we call it Nuclear Matters. It involves people like Carol Browner, who used to be head of the EPA, who was at one time fervently anti-nuclear and has completely changed her views because of her concerns about global warming and is now fervently pro-nuclear. People like Spence Abrahams, who was Secretary of the Department of Energy. And so we've come together to talk about plants which already exist, and that's why David's ending is where I'd like to pick up. This is obviously a panel of experts who know the weeds and know the process of how nuclear power runs. We're talking about it, however, from 20,000 feet, the basic public policy implications of closing nuclear plants which already exist prematurely, like Kewanee, like Vermont Yankee in my part of the country. These plants, and there are about 20 physical facilities which are at risk and about 10 actual locations, are confronting almost a perfect storm of problems, which are driving economic policies which David outlined as leading to the closing of Kewanee. The first is that nuclear power gets no credit for the fact that it is non-carbon emitting. That makes no sense, you know. As a very practical matter, under the new EPA rules or any proposal which is pointed at the purpose of getting our global emission of carbon down, you can't get there from here without nuclear power. Certainly in the next 10, 20, 30 years you can't get there. And that's when all these plants are operating at their highest levels. As was mentioned in David's undertaking here in Connecticut, 97% of Connecticut's non-carbon emitting power is nuclear. In my state of New Hampshire, it's 87%. Across the river in New York, it's about 66%. Nationally, it's about 63, 62% of all the non-carbon emitting power in this country is nuclear. You can't take that offline and replace it with solar or wind or other alternative source energies as much as we support those sources of energy, because there's simply no capacity to do that within those alternative sources. What they will be replaced with, as was mentioned, is carbon emitting sources. And in fact, in Vermont Yankee's experience, which is more local to myself in New Hampshire, the fact that it's coming offline means that first prices will go up in one county in New Hampshire by about 50%, but more significantly than that, or that's pretty significant for those folks, but equally significant, you're adding about 114,000 new cars to the road. That's the amount of carbon that's going to be emitted. And the power will come from outside New England as versus being produced in New England, and it'll be oil-based mostly. The second thing that's driving this policy was again mentioned, which is that nuclear is reliable energy. It runs 24/7. It runs 90% of the time. Other energy sources, although very important, don't have that type of reliability record. And when we went through the recent polar vortex, which those of us in New Hampshire experienced rather bitterly, it was nuclear that carried us. A lot of regions in this country could not have gotten power without nuclear because some of the other power sources were not functioning because of the cold. Third is this whole public policy issue, and this really concerns myself and Evan Bayh, of putting too many eggs in one basket. We're moving to gas. We understand that. We've had this huge revolution, and it's a positive for us as a nation, the fact that we now are basically going to be energy self-sufficient for all intents and purposes in the foreseeable future. But you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And when nuclear represents 20% of your energy base load, to take that offline and move it to gas, that's foolish. That's, as a matter of strategy and national security, a foolish decision, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. And that's something that we're very concerned about. The fourth item that is driving this concern and creating this economic problems for these plants, which, by the way, can have a great useful life in front of them but are going to be turned off potentially prematurely, is the fact that transmission lines in this country are aged. And so as these plants produce extra energy, in times when the energy is not needed in their region, they can't get it out. They can't move it because of the aging infrastructure. So what Nuclear Matters is trying to do, myself and this group that's come together, is communicate the message of the importance of these existing plants. We're not talking about new plants, although I happen to very strongly support new nuclear facilities, but we're talking about the existing plants which may go offline before their useful life is up, and saying, hey, you know, this is a cut off your nose to spite your face policy. It makes absolutely no sense from a standpoint of public policy to turn off all baseload production, which is already there and which can exist into the future for a considerable number of years. You know, there's that old story, and it especially applies here to the issue of carbon reduction, because if you're concerned about global warming, you've got to be pro-nuclear at this time. There's that old story in New England, up in New Hampshire, which we tell, which is Oscar Payne, who was about 85 years old, was sitting on his front porch of the local country store and rocking in his chair, and a car from New York pulled up, a great big huge Suburban, you know, big black one. And the person leaned out the window and said to him, "How do you get to Pike, New Hampshire from here?" And Oscar thought for a minute and said, "Well, you go up this road, take a right." Nope. No, you go back down here about 6 miles and no. Well, there's a road that goes over that mountain there. No. Well, you know you can't get there from here. That's the situation. You cannot get to where we need to get in the area of carbon reduction without nuclear power. And until we have policies, and this is where we're hopefully moving towards, which reflect the importance of carbon reduction, of reliability, and of diversity in how you price power, especially for existing power plants, we're going to be paddling upstream without an oar. So we're making this case. It's a public policy initiative, a public information initiative. We haven't put out specific proposals yet, but it's an attempt to educate folks on the importance of the existing power plants.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're not sleeping from lunch, but I'll try to wake you up a little bit. I'm going to just talk about regulatory perspectives right now because you get to hear me again, poor you, drone on about larger issues. So I'll keep my focus small. So I want to talk a little bit about a credible regulator. We've heard on some of the earlier panels the importance of a regulator. I think Mark Peters talked about it a bit as well. And I think it's important that we have a credible regulator. And what does that mean? Without a credible regulator, there won't be public trust in the system, and without public trust, there won't be support for nuclear power. And we've had a few discussions dancing around this issue with some of the questions from the audience already today, and so I'll go on a little bit more about it. Public support is lost when the regulator is not open and transparent. What do I mean by open and transparent? Open means that you are open to having conversations, engaging with the public, meeting with the public on a regular basis, and transparent means that you make all of your processes and decision-making transparent so that you publish and make available all of your documentation and all of your thinking. And unfortunately, one thing that the Fukushima accident highlighted, which I'll explain more in the next talk, is that there are differences between how different countries regulate, and the public sees this, and so standardization can be important. Let me speak domestically for a minute, and then I'll go to more of an international perspective. So some of the regulatory issues that have come up, there is some new build in the U.S. I think you've heard it. Actually, 5 reactors are under construction. One is an old design that will probably be completed and up and running later this year. The other 4 are new designs that were talked about at the previous panel. And we've had these new plants, these 4 new ones, the AP1000s, the Westinghouse plants, are licensed under a new process, a combined operating license. And so this has been a learning experience for both the licensees and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And one of the experiences and one of the lessons that everybody has learned is that the licensee is responsible for any issues that come up, not the contractors or subcontractors to the licensee. But that's a bit in the weeds. For operating reactors, you're right, we do, Senator's right, that there are a number of plants that are in financial jeopardy right now. But in terms of regulatory issues, we do have an aging fleet. Many of the plants have reached their 40-year original license life. They're now been granted 20-year license extensions. But with aging comes issues, replacements of large parts, et cetera. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has ensured that these older plants have aging management programs in place, but it's something that is going to have to be watched. And then there are reactors like Kewaunee, which is now undergoing decommissioning. And this has been another issue of late because a number of plants in the past couple years have decided to shut down and permanently decommission. And unfortunately, the regulations that exist for decommissioning plants are the same ones for operating plants, and they don't make a whole lot of sense in a number of areas. So something that I was able to do just before I left the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was to ensure that there will be new regulations for decommissioning plants that will come through and hopefully be more appropriate. So that's some of the domestic issues. From an international point of view, and we heard some of this in the previous panels as well, the majority of new build is going on elsewhere, mostly in China. Really, the vast majority is going in China, a little bit in Russia, a little bit in India, and as I said, the US has 5 plants going up. But there are many countries that have said that they would like to develop nuclear power. And there's been a lot of talk about this over the past 5 or 8 years. Not a whole lot of action, but the United Arab Emirates, you see pictured on the right at the Braca site here, is building 4 reactors. Turkey and Vietnam have signed deals with the Russians to develop reactors. There are other hopeful countries that are a little further off, and quite a few others actually there are over 60 countries that have said that they would like to develop nuclear power that don't have nuclear power. The problem is that a number of these countries, these emerging countries, have either weak or nascent regulators. And so let me talk a little bit about the importance of an independent regulator and what a regulator is. Because, before I got involved in the NRC, regulators kind of put you to sleep, I think. But they are really, really important and essential. First of all, it's essential that the regulator not be influenced by any politician, any political views, and it also should not have any industry influence. It should make decisions independently. It should also have adequate financial resources to do the evaluations that it needs to do, and it should have adequate expertise on staff to do these things. And of course, it should have the full support of the central government to be independent. This is not so easy in many places. And it has to have real enforcement authority. It has to be able to shut down a plant if it sees that there's a problem, because otherwise it's not going to be taken seriously. So without an independent regulator, I would argue that a country puts itself at grave risk of both economic and public health danger. Because if something were to happen, they would not have a way of protecting themselves. Now let me turn to this issue of standardizing regulations. There is no international body that sets regulations for nuclear power in all countries. And I think Fukushima highlighted some of these issues pretty well in terms of countries' reactions to the accident and what they recommended to their people, and then countries' reactions after the accident. You might be asking about the International Atomic Energy Agency. They set guidelines and standards that countries can choose to adopt if they wish to, but they don't, usually. There is something called the Convention on Nuclear Safety, which was established after the Chernobyl accident as a way to try to legally require countries to set high safety standards. But this is just an incentive instrument. It doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. The enforcement is done by peer review, which happens every 3 years. And I just want to give you a little example of some of the things that have happened recently with regards to the Convention on Nuclear Safety. The sixth review meeting was a year ago in Vienna, and it was important because it was an opportunity for countries to peer review each other's changes after Fukushima. And some countries wanted explicit changes that would be codified in the law of contracting parties, and the only way they saw that they could do that was to change the convention itself. So the Swiss government actually proposed amending the convention, and they wanted to add language that said something to the effect of, should an accident occur, mitigating effects and avoiding the releases of radionuclides would be essential, and that these objectives should be applied to operating plants. So in other words, you would have to have new regulations, new laws that said that operating plants could not have an accident that would emit radiation off the site. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable, so in the end, they decided there was a diplomatic convention. There was a lot of money spent and sweat equity spent trying to deal with this. In the end, they made a Vienna Declaration. They did not open the convention, which is a good thing because our Senate would have approved it, and we'd ask the senator his odds on whether they would have approved it or not. So I just want to end with the importance of the regulator in this whole process of thinking about the future of nuclear energy and a tie between climate change and nuclear energy. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So would any of our panelists like to say something based on the comments of others? David, you went first. Anything in particular that this stimulated for you?
I agree with Allison that a tough and credible regulator is in everybody's interest. The industry and the regulator have a common interest, as does the citizenry. No one wants an operation that might cause harm to the public. So there are incentives on both sides. There are economic and public relations and just common sense incentives on the part of industry operators. And the regulator has got a charter to provide reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public safety. So there's an intersection there. I would say over the last, since 1981 when INPO was formed, that an attitude of self-regulation permeates this industry in a way that is not matched in any other industry. The offshore oil BP situation prompted the offshore oil industry to take a look at how nuclear is self-regulating. The airline industry has got some positive features. However, none come close to the degree of self-regulation that exists in the United States. I do agree it does vary widely around the world. I'll just say a brief word about new nuclear and comment on one thing that was said at lunchtime. Because we are preparing for the eventuality of small modular reactors. We're participating in providing customer requirements to U.S. DOE. I spoke with Ernie Moniz the day before yesterday. Dominion has been pursuing an early site permit and combined construction and operating license to provide the option for future build. But more close to the more close on the horizon, we are a lead plant. Our Surrey plant will be a lead plant in demonstrating subsequent license renewal beyond 60 years to 80 years, which may significantly extend the carbon mitigating benefit of the existing fleet. There are 3 plants that are being considered for that right now to test 3 different technologies. But at present, the regulatory framework seems suitable for that. The present state of research seems suitable for that, and we're proud to be a leader in vetting out this possibility of taking a plant that was originally designed and licensed for 40 years, already licensed renewed out to 60 years, and now we may be able to go out to 80 years. That has profound implications for U.S. carbon emissions.
Well, let me follow up on that in saying that an independent and strong regulator is absolutely critical to public confidence. And so much of the nuclear issue surrounds public confidence. So what the nuclear industry is doing, which has been exceptional in self-disciplining, is geometrically improved by having a regulator who oversees that and enforces it. And so that is a critical element of getting nuclear to be, the American public to be comfortable with nuclear. In the foreign markets, I do think it's important for us to remember that American nuclear technology is still cutting-edge technology. And even though we only have 5 plants coming online here in the United States in the foreseeable future, across the world there are 87 plants that are being built and there are 170 plants that are on the drawing boards. And we would like that to be American technology. And it's pretty hard to make the case that we're going to have American technology being sold into these different plants if we don't have nuclear as a vibrant industry here in the United States. To not have it be American energy, American technology is going to have 2 effects. One, it's going to affect jobs here in the United States. But 2, I actually think it affects safety, because I think American technology is much more safety-oriented than maybe some of the other technologies that have been used. Certainly that was true in Russia. So I do think it's important for us to remember that there's a foreign component in our nuclear industry that is very important for jobs in the United States, for export in the United States, and for maintaining a worldwide fleet that's safe.
I'll just say something about the foreign markets, and then I have a question for the three of you. So, and just going on the senator's comments about the kind of technologies that might be deployed in these emerging countries, Russia is really being very aggressive with its model, trying to sell its new model of the VVER 1000, its light water reactor. They operate using a BOO model, B-O-O, build, own, operate, which means they go to a country, they say, don't worry, we've got a great deal for you. We're going to build your plant, we're going to help you finance it, we'll operate it, and we'll own it. And all you have to do is pay for the electricity. It sounds like a great deal, and countries are buying it up. But, again, the question is, do they have regulators who are capable of overseeing what the Russians do? That is, I think, an important question out there. So that particular issue needs to be approached with a lot of caution.
You know, on that point, it's a side issue, but there are the EXIM banks coming up for reauthorization, and conservatives tend to be opposed to EXIM because it's a government basically entering a marketplace. But as a practical matter, the nuclear industry can't compete overseas unless it has EXIM support. And it's something that if you're a political scientist major here at Yale, you might want to follow that debate, because it's a fascinating cross-current of conservative ideology meeting practical real-world markets.
So can I ask my question?
Sure.
So you, the two of you especially, but you're welcome to jump in, talked about the current economic situation that faces nuclear power. And one piece that you didn't mention, but I think from my analysis bears on the success or failure of nuclear, especially on the new build side, is the restructuring of the electricity markets, which occurred a number of years ago, but have now made it almost impossible to build new plants in the unregulated markets. So the only place that you see new plants going up are in the regulated markets. Was that a big mistake? Can we reverse that policy?
I don't know if it's a big mistake, but we're talking to a bunch of very bright people who are going to start focusing on that when they graduate. I would say that it is at the present time, at first, when she talks about unregulated electricity markets, if you're not familiar with it, it's probably be a 10-hour lecture to familiarize yourself with it. Most people do not have any idea of how complex the U.S. electric system is between regulated, deregulated, independent system operators in New England are different than PJM, different than MISO. ERCOT, Texas runs it different. CalISO in California runs it different. It is immensely complex, and I've started to see the hand of FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, gently start to nudge some degree of commonality in terms of ISOs. But at the present time, I would say, yes, it's virtually impossible in a deregulated market to obtain financing for a new nuclear power plant.
Yeah, I had a question along the same lines, and it's for everyone, and that is that we have a question from the floor. Under what conditions would it have been acceptable for Dominion not to have shut down the Wisconsin nuclear plant? I wanted to ask a question that's sort of related to that more generally. And that is, in the EPA Clean Power Plan, EPA urges states as part of their compliance strategy to take actions to ensure that the 6% of nuclear plants that are supposedly at risk don't close. And my question is, how do they do that? Particularly, how are states which don't regulate the price of electricity, how do they influence the decision of whether or not plants will close or have their life extended? So what are the tools that either states have or will need, in order to affect your decisions to close a plant or not?
Well, let me get to the second question first and answer in a way that I think I heard it. I didn't read that into the proposed Clean Power Plan in the first rev, but keep in mind it's a draft, and there was an opportunity, many opportunities for public comment, and I believe over 3 million comments have been provided, some as little as 1 page long, some as long as 2,000 pages. All of those comments have been and are being reviewed by the U.S. EPA, and we expect late summer to have the final rule out. So we'll see what the final rule says with respect to the 6% at risk. But I'll reiterate, in talking with Gina McCarthy, she keenly appreciates the value that nuclear brings to the table and insists that it's got to be part of the energy mix going forward as we seek to decarbonize the electric sector to the degrees that are intended by that regulation. Insofar as Kiwani goes, we did explore a number of opportunities. We negotiated at length with counterparties up there for power purchase agreements. We actually tried to sell the plant to larger operators such as Exelon, where they might have been able to extract other efficiencies. We talked to the governor. I suppose a reliability must-run contract could have been entered into by the state, but that would have required what some might have perceived as a politically risky move. At the time, we were not able to achieve that. And the short version of the story is that the power plant would have needed compensation of about 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour to remain in operation, and we couldn't achieve that.
But just leaving aside EPA, because you're right that may well change. A lot of the speakers have talked about the importance of keeping existing nuclear power online if we're going to try to meet our carbon goals. And I'd just be interested in having all of the panelists talk a little bit about what kinds of policies would be necessary in order to achieve that. In other words, people have said, we've got all this nuclear, we want to keep it online. What are the various policy instruments that would be necessary in order to achieve that goal? And I think that, as I understand it, was really the intent of the question about closing down your Wisconsin nuclear power plant. And what I'm hearing you say, and maybe that's the answer, is it's price. Is there anything other than price that you really need?
Well, one thing is for certain, we would never compromise on safety goals. I mean, so if it were a different type of factory in an emerging country, maybe you cut half of the O&M and try and slash costs. This industry is not about that, so we will never compromise on safety standards. We know how much it costs to achieve good, reliable, safe operations. So yeah, it basically boils down to price. I think more recently, a company has been in negotiations with the state of New York about extending the life of a unit up there that's under scrutiny.
Did you want to add something?
Can I ask a quick follow-up, David? What happens to the plant? What happens when a nuclear power plant dies?
Jobs go away, tax base goes away, the carbon emissions in the state go up, and it just so happens that about a year later, one of the incumbent utilities came back to the state and filed for approval to build a gas plant of roughly the comparable size. So the really ironic piece, and for the economists in the room, there's something called the missing money problem, and if you haven't, you can read about it in Tuesday's Wall Street Journal. But the market was compensating us at about $30 to $35. We needed about $50 to $55. We shut the plant down, and now it's being replaced for something that's got a levelized cost of $70 to $75. So the markets are not, there may be market flaws that are not adequately compensating these units for the attributes they bring to the table.
Yes. Does the plant have to continue to be monitored, I would assume?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The nuclear fuel is still there. There's a lengthy process by which you have to get the fuel out, get it into dry casks, and all the time you've got to take adequate measures to protect the public from anything that could happen. We have a large security force still there, so there's a number of things. But it's a long ramp, and eventually, the monies have already been accumulated. That's something a lot of people don't realize, is that nuclear power is really the only large-scale form of electric power where all of the costs have already been internalized. We've saved the money for decommissioning. That's already been provided for. The funds to dispose of spent fuel have already been accumulated. So all of the externalities have already been included in the costs.
I think you're going to see some states try to address this issue and move away from spot pricing to giving credit for lack of carbon emission, because they're going to be under pressure to do that, to keep their carbon emissions down, to give credit for reliability, and to give credit for diversity. Illinois is actually wrestling with this issue right now in their state legislature, and they may end up being a template for how a state addresses this issue.
Yeah, just in terms of the shutdown, you guys have experience locally with a decommissioned plant, what was called Haddam Neck, Connecticut Yankee, CY. And as far as I know, it's now down to just the spent fuel pad, right? So it's greenfielded, just like Maine Yankee is in Yankee Row. All the Yankees got greenfielded except for the spent fuel. So all that remains is the spent fuel.
Well, we have several questions from the floor. One is, would a cut in unnecessary sources of carbon emissions, a major example of which is animal agriculture, 18% of CO2 emissions, more than all transportation combined, would cutting those emissions not be more effective than investment in new and expensive technology that we do not yet have a sound understanding of? I'm not sure what the new and expensive technology is, maybe renewables, but in any event, what about reducing other sources of carbon emissions like animal agriculture?
I guess the only thing I could offer there is if a state under the Clean Power Plan offers that to the EPA as a mechanism for compliance, then I think the EPA would have to consider it. Although the rule tends to apply strictly to the electric sector.
Mm-hmm. I think there'd be certain political issues that you might run into, called farmers.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key issues, is that historically EPA has found it easier to focus on automobiles and electric utilities, in part because they're concentrated. So it's a little easier to regulate them, and it's also easier to regulate them politically. When you have something that's very spread out, like animal agriculture, it's just harder from an environmental standpoint.
There's no stronger political lobby in the Congress than the agriculture.
I will say this, that no one on this panel or any panel today pretends that nuclear power is a silver bullet or the only answer. I mean, efficiency is going to make a big difference in the amount of power consumption that occurs in the United States. So we've already seen in recent decades a flattening of our energy intensity. So we've got, for the same amount of GDP, we're using less and less electricity. So efficiency plays a big role.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, next question. One major barrier to overcome with nuclear energy is public perception and support. Many fear the perceived dangers of nuclear or have a not in my backyard mentality. How can the media and films like Pandora's Promise and public education help the nuclear community's case? So how do we deal with public perception issues?
You know, that's what we're trying to do with Nuclear Matters specifically. We're trying to raise the awareness of people as the importance of the role of nuclear power in their everyday electrical needs. You know, when a person walks into their home, they turn on their lights, they don't care where the power comes from. They just want the lights to go on. And when the lights don't go on, they get very upset. And the point we're trying to make is those lights may not go on, or they may go on sporadically, or the power that's putting them on may be affecting your environment. So why don't you seriously look at nuclear power as an option? And it's having resonance. It's having fairly significant resonance, in fact. When somebody like Carol Browner, who was one of the most active, as she takes credit for this, one of these most active people in opposition to nuclear power in the 60s and the 70s, completely changes her position because she recognizes that global warming, in her opinion, is the single biggest concern we should have as a culture from a standpoint of our long-term existence as a planet, and becomes a strong advocate for nuclear. That shows that folks of reason who have historically maybe come out of a culture that said nuclear power was not the right way to go, especially during the 60s and 70s, are rethinking the issue. And if you are of reason, common sense as we refer to it in New Hampshire, then you've got to give credit where credit's due, which is that you cannot get there from here, as I said, if you're going to try to reduce carbon emissions, unless you use nuclear power as a major component of that for the foreseeable future.
So I have a slightly different view from the questioner who's appealing to education of the public to improve the perception. I think that's, I personally think that's the wrong way to go, that it's not about educating the public. That's basically a patronizing point of view. You know, if they only knew as much as me. I think it's very important to enter into conversation, to engage with the public and discuss their concerns and be open about it. This is something that I tried to do at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission because the NRC does do a lot of public engagement, but it tends to be one way. And I worked with the industry, and I was very impressed with some parts of the nuclear industry in their ability to try to reach out to the public. For example, one of the new plants, the one that I mentioned that's coming on this year, Watts Bar, it's in Tennessee. They have a public engagement panel, and they recently expanded it to beyond the nuclear supporters to some of the nuclear detractors. And they've gotten a lot of really positive feedback because they've taken the time, they meet with folks, they answer their questions, they demystify it, they bring people onto the site, show them the reactor. That's the kind of engagement that I think is really important. And, you know, mounting education campaigns, it's been tried for many decades. I think you've got enough data to show that it hasn't worked. You need a new approach.
And just from an academic standpoint, that's really what all the literature shows, that it has to be really an interactive process, not a one-way process. Here's a good question. It's for Allison, but also for the other members of the panel. Is it possible to compare nuclear regulation in a country such as France with the United States? Are there advantages, disadvantages in the two systems? And I might broaden that a little bit while you're thinking about it to why are there such differences internationally in the acceptability of nuclear power in various countries? You have countries like Germany that was mentioned before, decided to shift away from it. As I understand it, basically not really very controversial right across the border in France. So how do we understand these very large differences in terms of public perceptions of nuclear power, and does it have something to do, as the questioner suggests, with the structure of the regulatory system?
No. I don't think it has anything to do with the structure of the regulatory system. I think it has to do with culture. And I'm not an anthropologist, but I refer you to them to help explain the differences. And, you know, in terms of...
So they drink wine in France and they drink beer in Germany.
They drink wine in Germany, too. And they drink beer in France, too. Anyway, I think they're just cultural differences. And Germany has long been skeptical of nuclear power. So this recent move away from it as a result of Fukushima is really not a surprise. They were going there. And they're not the only ones who made that decision. You know, the Swiss did as well. And the Italians had been thinking of restarting their nuclear power program, and after Fukushima decided not to. So they're not alone. And some countries have had no reaction. I mean, in the United States, the reaction hasn't been so severe. It's been more of an awareness that nuclear safety is important. And so people who'd sort of stopped paying attention to their local nuclear power plant have started paying attention again. And that's where the importance of engaging with them, I think, is to be found. But in terms of the differences in nuclear regulators around the world, there's no one right way to regulate. There are a number of approaches that will work equally well. But I think the important thing is that the regulators talk to each other, which they do, and that they learn from each other, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel if somebody else has figured out how to solve a particular problem. So,
did you want to add something?
Well, I tend to agree on the cultural comment. I've been in 92 plants on 4 continents, including South Africa, Russia, China, Korea, Japan, Finland, France, England, Canada. But so the one thing as a nuclear operator that I have a slight concern about is that every country has a tendency to think they do it best. And the reality is that no one can be complacent. This is a demanding technology, and everyone has to pay attention. And to think that you do it the best is, to me, a slight measure of complacency, and I would dissuade people from that, including in the United States. It's a demanding technology.
One question that you referred to, Allison, is learning from regulation in other countries. What would be some examples of the kinds of things you think we might be able to learn from the French?
The French, everybody, you keep marching the poor French out.
Well, that was the question was about that, but I mean, I think a lot of people have perceived France as one of the countries that has been most successful, at least in terms of public acceptability. So I just wonder if you think there's anything we can learn from them, or it's just such a different country that we really shouldn't learn from them.
Now, you know, the one point of contention right now between the European regulators, French included, and the U.S. is that the European regulators, and actually most other regulators, like the Canadians, et cetera, do something called a periodic safety review. So every 10 years, they don't license their plants for 40-year or 20-year chunks. Every 10 years, they do a full review of their plant. And they say that's the right way to do it. We don't do that in the United States. We license our plants for a 40-year chunk or a 20-year chunk, and we say that's good enough. But what we do in the U.S. that they don't do in other countries is that we have inspectors, at least 2 NRC inspectors who work full-time at each plant. They are there all the time. They're inspecting the facility all the time. So we have real-time information on any kind of problems that are cropping up. Whereas in other countries, inspectors may show up once a month, once every couple weeks. So there are different ways of doing it.
Okay, we have some additional questions. Here's one that was focused particularly on David, but I think anyone can address it. The question is, rather than taxing carbon to make it more expensive, can we support nuclear?
Say that again?
Well, the question is, rather than taxing carbon to make it more expensive, can we support nuclear? I think maybe you've already answered that when you said nuclear alone can't really solve the problem. But I think the question was, do we need a carbon tax?
Oh, you mean like a nuclear subsidy?
Yeah, well, they say rather than taxing carbon to make it more expensive, can we support nuclear? So the question would be, rather than negative incentives to increase the cost of carbon-emitting generation, could we do this by additional subsidies to nuclear and other non-emitting generation?
And I don't know if that's the best way to get at it. Policy development, best left to policy experts. If we can get them to focus on it and consider a number of alternatives, there may be different ways of getting at the problem. Presently, I would say if you tried to the policies generally are derived to not favor, or ideally not favor any particular fuel. You want to generate a policy framework that allows businesses to make decisions that will generate the result that you want. But so I guess in theory I can understand that it might be possible, but I don't have a policy answer for that.
Do either of you want to comment on that?
I think a carbon tax is some kind of price on carbon, and a tax is just the most straightforward way of doing it, with all the provisos of trying to make it revenue neutral, et cetera, and is the easiest way to approach this problem. But I don't know, for utility companies that own a variety of energy sources, I don't know if this makes a difference to you, because it's going to hurt your carbon emitting side, but help the non-carbon emitting side.
But if it's federal and it's applied nationwide, it's I think a more equitable way of doing it than perhaps say the RGGI or something.
Yeah, well, you're not going to have a carbon tax. It's not politically doable. It's a value-added tax, and it's not going to pass a Congress even if the Congress went back to a different makeup. It's simply not going to happen. So this issue has to be addressed without presuming that you can move to a carbon tax, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, just a comment on it, and that is that we've tried for a number of years to encourage renewables and low carbon generation through a variety of subsidies, and I'm not sure that we can push that even farther than we have to date. And I think the other thing to remember is that the subsidies, at least if they have to go through Congress, are influenced by the political dynamics in the Congress, and so oftentimes existing systems may be better able at getting subsidies. There is a report by the Environmental Law Institute that claims the subsidies for fossil energy are much larger than those for renewable energy, which reflects the political dynamic rather than maybe what might make sense from a policy standpoint. So here's another question, which is for you, but anybody can address it. Does a wind, water, solar only grid strain the old transmission system more? So I don't think we've ever had a wind, water, solar only grid, but I take it the question is, does increasing reliance on non-nuclear renewables put particular challenges on the grid?
Well, I think that as a practical matter, to the extent we can get more renewables, the better off we are. But the grid's problems are not unique to renewables or to fossil or to nuclear. What's unique is that nuclear runs so efficiently and in such a continuum, so that it's a 90% operation, that there are a lot of times that nuclear is producing power that the power can't actually be moved because of the transmission lines. Now, that may be true also with wind in certain parts of the country. It may be true with solar in certain parts of the country. But it's a real significant problem for nuclear because of its reliability levels, which are 90% as versus some of these other sources.
So, let me just mention, we like renewables too. We put in about 250 megawatts of solar last year. We've got 282 megawatts of wind. I will tell you that on the day of the polar vortex, January 7th, 2014, wind output was substantially zero, either due to no wind or due to blades having iced over. When I first got this job, the first place I went was out to the National Renewable Energy Lab to figure out where all this was headed and talk to the smartest people in the country about it. And I was looking at the frequency response of solar panels to cloud passage in the eastern United States. The output goes from 90% to essentially 10% in 1 second on cloud passage, and that does create some technological challenge. And I think over time those will get solved by technology, but at present our analysis is that at about 30% renewable penetration on any given circuit, you can create instabilities at the distribution level, and those instabilities will transmit up into the transmission system because transformers work both ways. So, renewables are coming. You're going to see a lot more of them. There's absolutely no question about it. You're going to see more solar. You're going to see more wind. I doubt if you'll see more hydro. There's more dams being taken down in the U.S. than being erected. But you're going to see a lot more renewables going forward, and it's going to supplant perhaps some retiring coal and some older inefficient plants. There's a lot of engineering challenges coming with it.
So one way to think about the problem is that the transmission grid was built to service the previous energy supply system. So you've got grid going from the places we were generating energy previously to where the load centers are. And if renewables such as solar or wind, the preferential locations for those don't happen to be in the same locations as you previously had power plants, by definition, you're going to have to build some more grid in order to be able to get the renewable into it, right?
Correct.
So that's going to be a challenge one way or the other. So here's the next question. Are there many, there are many nuclear power stations in China. Do you think the regulation policy is good enough? So I don't know who wants to take on the Chinese regulators.
I can't say. I'm very familiar with the Chinese regulation policy, but they have a number of nuclear plants. They're very ambitious. They've got a lot under construction. Keep in mind, though, that even though they're doing all this construction and maybe they'll have close to 100 plants in another, 20 years or so, that is really so small in terms of the amount of electricity they use. It is almost irrelevant in terms of their carbon output because they use so much coal. And even though they're building nuclear as fast as they can, it's really not going to make that much of a difference, sadly, in China. So China needs a lot more than just nuclear.
Well, my understanding is they've made a national decision not to build additional coal plants, but to have all the growth take place in nuclear and renewables. We'll see whether or not they can do that, but that's what I understand their goal is. Anybody else want to comment on Chinese regulation?
Beginning when? No. I've visited a couple of their plants, and they seem to be constructed to Western standards, and I think the focus has got to be on good, solid operator training and performance.
So here's another question. Can you talk about MSRs? I take it that's modular small reactors?
SMRs, yeah.
SMRs?
Well, they said MSRs. Molten salt reactors? Who asked about MSRs and what do they mean? Molten salt reactors, okay. And thorium from regulatory and other perspectives. So these are some emerging technologies in the nuclear field.
I've only recently become aware of some very interesting things happening in the thorium space, but I see it's far enough down the planning horizon where it doesn't get a lot of attention for me on a day-to-day basis, and similarly with molten salt. So it's good that we're doing the research. The DOE is, spending money and allocating research monies to small modular reactors going forward, and maybe even molten salt reactors. But as on our planning horizon, which is a 15-year planning horizon, we submit a plan every year that looks out 15 years. They don't show up.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of dealing with the climate problem, they are not going to be your answer. Okay, not in this time frame. In terms of the regulatory aspects, we do occasionally, NRC did when I was there, hear from people who say, you're not going to be prepared. Well, somebody actually has to have a design that works, that is beyond what's on a piece of paper or is, at laboratory scale this big. You have to have a design that works, you have to have a plan, and then you have to submit a design certification application. And that will take some time to do. But nobody is anywhere close to that. They are decades off. So this is not something that's going to help anywhere in the near term when we need it.
Don, do you have many more written questions? I was going to suggest if there are any
two more
direct questions from the audience.
Two more questions, right. And then why don't we do that? And then we'll open it up there. So this next question really is two separate questions. So I'm going to segregate them, let the panelists respond to them separately. The first question is, or the first statement is, the Fukushima accident showed a weakness in the way nuclear plants operate and are regulated. So I guess we'll segregate that off and see whether or not people agree with that.
I don't particularly agree that it shows a weakness in the way they're operated, but I think it shows a weakness in siting and design. Although some of the root cause work that's still being done does have elements of operations in it, I will agree with that. And I do think culturally, the ability to learn site to site in Japan is not as robust as it is in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes, so stay tuned.
The second half of the question is, how do regulations and the industry's response to regulations take a risk-based approach into account. And then it goes on to say, obviously, a seismic event or a flood someplace like Louisiana or Arizona is a small probability, but an incredible amount of resources being dedicated to these initiatives. So I guess the question is, do we regulate on a risk-based basis?
Yes. Next question.
Okay, next question. This will be the last one, then we'll open it up for the floor. You see regulated states like Georgia, Florida, South Carolina making long-term investments into nuclear. Do you see deregulated markets as short-sighted, and do you see these states moving back to regulated models? I guess this is the question about regulation that you asked earlier, and I ask it in a different way about how do you provide appropriate incentives in deregulated states?
The ultimate question there is, do I see a movement, or do we see a movement? I don't see a movement. I think at present we're in a transitory state where there's a great number of unknowns regarding distributed generation, rooftop solar, other factors. So I don't see a movement in deregulated states back to regulation. But I do see concerns on the part of state regulators and state citizens on the availability of their nuclear plants to fulfill their mission. So in Illinois, in New York, there is a focus on, okay, there's a problem. Let's see if there's a way to solve this that's fair to everybody.
One alternative that you're seeing some places is building other factors like reliability into the instructions that the independent service operators take into account. So currently, in a deregulated state, if you have an independent system operator, they tend to dispatch based on price alone. And what we're seeing developing somewhat is the notion that either nuclear or renewables is saying there are other factors in addition to price that should be taken into account. Yeah. That's without necessarily abandoning the deregulated market, but just building some of these other quality factors into the instructions that the independent system operators use.
Yeah, I do see focus at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and elsewhere about let's value the attributes appropriately and then dispatch. And what we haven't done maybe to date is value the attributes appropriately.
So questions from the floor.
I have a question for Ms. McFarland. You said that in China, even with the nuclear plants that they're going to build, it will be a very small fraction of their electricity generating capability. We are at roughly 20%. What are they aiming for?
That's a good question. I don't have those numbers. Maybe somebody else does here. One of you climate guys? No?
I don't think they have a terminus, but I think if they build 50 plants, they'll be at about 8%.
Yeah.
Even less than half?
Yes. Boo.
Operate,
own.
They also have discussed fuel take-back.
Yes, they have.
Now, given the fact that as a government policies, we're very much interested in nuclear safety worldwide because the implications it can have on our own industry if there are accidents. And given the issue of non-proliferation, in particular with some of the emergent countries, really don't want to deal with nuclear waste because they'll have small programs. Is there any possibility that the U.S. government would have a fuel take-back program to support national policy?
Well, I'm pretty skeptical because we can't even solve our own nuclear waste policies.
I think when you see the debate that's going on over the Exim Bank, you're not going to anything that would even take that a leap. That would be a leap of further in federal subsidy of international activity in nuclear construction. I don't think it'll happen.
Regis, I don't see the fuel take-back piece, but there is one element of integration that is being attempted, and that is on the fuel supply side. In other words, the Russians will say, we'll mine it for you, we'll mill it for you, we'll enrich it for you. or convert it, enrich it, fabricate it, and then we'll take it back. So the U.S. essentially has very little, if any, remaining enrichment capability, and I believe that Centrus is now trying to figure out a way to at least virtually integrate on the supply side to where the U.S. maintains enrichment capability and does not have to rely on the Russians, the Chinese, or some other country to provide enriched uranium for us.
So I have a question for Mr. Gregg, coming back to the carbon tax. You know, a lot of the discussion this afternoon has been about the economic factors of supplying different kinds of power. But this is all in the backdrop of a kind of threat to human welfare that we all see as grave and arguably rivaling that from the events of 9/11 or even Pearl Harbor, 60 years ago. But as a species, of course, we're much more used to threats from external nations attacking us rather than, natural factors that accrue over decades. So I guess the question is, are we really smart enough to see this global warming as a factor that's equivalent to an external threat by some foreign power and respond and not really ask so diligently or so exactingly about the economic aspects?
Well, that's a good question. The marketplace of ideas in the United States is extremely diffused and very robust. And there are a lot of different views on almost any topic that you want to pick. But I think generally what you're seeing in the global warming debate is that most people on both sides of the aisle are taking the view that if you can do something that is logical and doesn't necessarily require some sort of extraordinary action that would be ideologically unacceptable, such as a carbon tax, then why not do it? If the outcome is that you're probably doing some benefit to the global warming issue, which is why the debate on nuclear power and keeping existing plants running has so much viability, quite honestly, on both sides of the aisle. So I do think that issue is not being addressed in the context that you're talking about, which is this is a threat to the United States, we've got to do something immediately, but it's being addressed more in the context of, yeah, it's a problem that we should address if we can address it without fundamentally changing ideological positions. And I think a lot of things come together that allow that to happen on a number of areas, whether it's alternative energy or whether, in fact, when I left the Senate, interestingly enough, which just shows how naive we were as senators, on the Republican caucus, our policy the last year I was there, energy policy, was build 100 new nuclear plants and have half the car fleet in America be electric by, we didn't pick a specific date, 2050, 2030. So you can see that there is convergence of ideas here to accomplish basically what we think is good policy for a lot of reasons, one of which is addressing global warming. So I think the opportunity is there.
We're going to take two more quick questions and then go for the break.
I was going to say your question or your statement reminded me of something I heard at a student A&S chapter meeting one time, which was nuclear power will have the last laugh. I only hope it isn't too late.
So we heard this morning that France transitioned from 8% nuclear energy to 70% within a decade. How are they able to move so fast, and why can't we do the same?
France again.
Well, I'm not quite so sure that it went from 8% to 70% within 10 years. And we did go through a period of of a lot of build in the 1970s to early 80s ourselves. So, you can ramp up quickly if you want to.
I can tell you what the French ambassador said the answer to that question was. They did a program in Washington that I attended about their nuclear program. And basically, they had decided that they were, after Fukushima, that they were too heavily dependent on nuclear, and they were going to reduce their dependence on nuclear to 50%. And basically what they said is, the cabinet just made this decision. So it's a parliamentary system. We don't have the separation of powers and so on that we have. They were able to just make so it's a central planning system with a parliamentary system. You don't have these pesky issues that we have of getting things through the Congress. The Prime Minister and the government are all unitary in a parliamentary system. So that's great if you make the right decision. You can implement it quickly. The problem is if you're wrong, you're really wrong. I have an article about this called "Why the United States Doesn't Have a Renewable Energy Policy." So you can, but a lot of it has to do with our separation of powers. It's much easier for China or France to simply make a decision and then implement it.
So we have one last question, moderator to moderator.
I have a question about the plant that's being decommissioned in Wisconsin. Why is it that we see it replaced by natural gas and not by a new nuclear plant at the same site?
Utilities, when they plan to meet future load, I'm not exactly sure how Wisconsin makes its decisions, but typically regulated utilities have to provide what's called an integrated resource plan that looks out 15 years and actually kind of tries to look beyond that to 25 years. Look at the various costs of generation based on in terms of installed capital cost and projected commodity costs, i.e. natural gas or coal or oil, and you put that into a linear program, and and you have to look at load growth, what your customer load growth is going to be, and you put all those inputs into a linear program, and it spits out a least cost solution. And so quite simply, gas today is the least cost solution for meeting customer demand. That's why Judge Gregg here referred to this concern about eventual over-reliance on natural gas as a primary electricity fuel supply and putting all of our eggs in one basket. But that's the answer that the linear program gives you. Then they present that to the State Corporation Commission, who has to make a determination on it that is in fact a prudent decision, and once the prudency review is done, then the utility goes and builds it.
So in a sense, there's an externality in the cost of natural gas, which is the uncertainty in the future cost that's not being internalized in this.
It is to the extent that we can predict commodity prices in the future. Now that history would show is subject to some debate, but you're right.
But you have the externality of the carbon. There is no price on carbon today, so you have a major externality, and the natural gas appears cheaper because you're not taking into account potentially the carbon effects over time. So there is an externality.
Don, we can do final remarks, or we can close the session.
Well, I'll offer the other panelists the opportunity to make final remarks if they want to delay people from getting to the coffee break. It's up to them.
Well said.
I admire you for sitting through it and becoming more educated and developing an enriched perspective by hearing a variety of speakers today. Nuclear is important today. It's going to be important in the future. And I thank you for your attention.
Sure. I think that you're getting a sense from the discussion we've had, some of the complexities associated with nuclear power, and I think they're important to talk about them and explore them and understand them from the financial or economic side, the regulatory side, the policy side, and in a little while I'll talk about the safety side.
If you're interested in further information on nuclear matters, please go to our website. And we'd be happy to have you participate. Thank you very much.
With that, I want to thank all of our panelists for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you very much. I'm actually